All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. We are pleased to host you all here today for this webinar on traversing the contours of AI, looking at the just future, which is second part of the webinar series organized by RGNUL RSSR in association with Mishi, Choudhary and Associates. So the purpose of this webinar here today is to discuss the various sectors in AI, including the education sector, the criminal justice sector, the criminal justice system. And then our panelists here today will also be reviewing the issues posed by artificial intelligence from ethical and gender perspective. So the format for this webinar here today is that each panelist will be discussing their respective topics, which will be followed by a Q&A session, which a few of the questions have been curated by us. And a lot of questions we have already received a lot of questions from our audience. So today we have with us Ms. Smriti Parsheera, who is a lawyer and a policy researcher at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She has previously worked with the Competition Commission of India and the UNDP. We also have with us Mr. Prasanth Sugathan, who is the legal director of Software Freedom Law Center, India, and is also a partner of Sugathan and Associates. Then we have with us Mr. Abhayraj Naik, who is an advisor, consultant, and an educator based in Bangalore. Mr. Naik is also a visiting faculty at Azim Premji University, where he teaches climate change, justice, and law. And our fourth panelist for today is Mr. Ameen Jauhar, who is a senior resident fellow with Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. So we welcome you all for this webinar, and thank you for taking out time for it today. So starting with the first round, where I would request you all to discuss various facets of the artificial intelligence, I would request Ms. Smriti Parsheera to take the screen and to talk about artificial intelligence from the lens of gender as well as facial recognition. Ms. Parsheera, handing it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Apurva, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having all of us as a part of this discussion. So, as Apurva introduced, I'm going to start by talking, in the first few minutes about questions around fairness and, non-discrimination in the context of artificial intelligence, particularly from a lens of gender. And I think where we need to start from is that often when we start talking about AI, and I know some of you have had one introductory session on that, we often talk about AI can do this, it cannot do this, AI needs to be responsible, AI is growing by leaps and bounds and things like that. And in all of these statements we often act as though AI has some agency of its own, like it can decide what to do. But in reality we know we are very, very far away from that kind of strong AI coming into being. So all of the decisions that are being made are actually being made by the men and women who are behind the structuring of this AI. So it really becomes important to question that, who are the people who are designing these tools? Where are they coming from? What do they think are problems that are worth solving? How do they classify something as intelligence versus something as not worth replicating as intelligence? So, a lot of debate around AI has been from this, and I want to start right from the beginning. So, as you all would know, even though we think of AI as some cutting edge technology right now, this is something which has been going on. Research has been happening since the mid 50s, And the first proposal really which came about where the term AI was coined for the first time was in 1955. And the proposal itself was drafted to be called a 2-month, 10-man study on artificial intelligence, right? So this 10-man, although many people would say, okay, of course, man means woman because general clauses access that, but really this 10-man has really stuck by. And if you look at the decades of history of artificial intelligence since then, it has been mostly the men who have been at the cutting edge of deciding, how this technology is to fare and what it's, being used for. So it's been an important label that has stuck on. And even today, so many years down the line, if you look at the field of STEM more broadly, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, it is, there is a chronic underrepresentation of women, certainly at the top higher levels, in this field. So women are not the ones setting the agenda in all of this. And someone would ask, why does it matter and how does it matter? But it matters because the questions which are found worth solving are decided by these individuals who are in this position to make decisions. And then moving on from this question of participation and representation, AI, of course, we know has this huge link with data, and where that data is coming from and what it's being used for, again, becomes this very gendered question, because there are so many examples, and I'll just use two for the introduction. The first one is about hiring decisions, right? So we know a lot of companies now are using AI for initial screening of applications, right? So when an application comes in, thousands of them come, and somebody doesn't want to physically go through them, so they'll put them, through an algorithm to filter out who is not a suitable match. And it has been found, and there are studies on this, and it's been found in the real world in a company as big as Amazon, where they found that because the AI was designed in such a way that it takes historical data and then uses that to interpret, going forward what is suitable or draw inferences. They found that because for 10 years all the people who were applying, who were being selected, who were getting through the process were men, when women candidates applied, they were being filtered out of the system because either they went to an all women college, which didn't seem like a good college to go to, or they said they were part of a women's baseball team or a volleyball team, and automatically they were getting filtered out. And there was time for reflection to think about that, because we relied so much on this taking place automatically to reduce our own burden, we ended up creating these discriminatory circumstances in the process. And lastly, like the other example I want to give is from the field of facial recognition, where anyone who's read about this would have come across, this is the most oft quoted study in this field, is called Gender Shades, where researchers from MIT found that they took popular facial recognition tools like the ones done by IBM, Microsoft, etc., and they put a bunch of photographs through them just to see that when a photo is put through the system, is it able to classify whether this is a male or a female person, right? And they found that for male white people, the error rates were really, really low. So it was, perfectly classifying them. It was less than 1% was the error rate. But for darker skinned females, the error rate was as high as 34%. So because the training data on which this, whole system had been trained was not equipped with the same kind of pool of female faces and darker female faces, the end result happened to be that, those faces were not classified. And of course, in the question of facial recognition, it's really debatable whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, because sometimes if the recognition is being used for a tool like surveillance, I would rather it didn't recognize me. But sometimes if it's used for saying, whether you're entitled to something or whether you can get through this barrier, then of course I want it to recognize me. So really this is to set the context, and I guess in the discussion we'll get deeper into discrimination and fairness and some of those issues.
Thank you, Ms. Parsheera. In fact, a lot of people do not know that before World War II, while we hear a lot about people like Alan Turing, a lot of enormous
Apurva, I think you're breaking a little. I'm not sure if it's just at my end.
Yeah. No, she is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you all? Oh, is it better now?
Yes.
Yes. Definitely. Like your frame's still frozen.
Maybe you could stop the video.
Yeah.
My apologies, my network is quite poor. I think I'm audible now. Hendrik, it's over to Mr. Jauhar, please. Mr. Jauhar will be talking about criminal justice system in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to quickly just also cover that I'm a senior resident fellow with Vidhi, and I'm actually steering Vidhi's fairly nascent work on AI ethics and governance, which is part of the larger team that works on law and technology and research focused on that. So I think Smriti's actually set a very good ground on questions of like, even currently, like despite we've having like decades of research behind this, there is no definitive way of defining AI. There's a very interesting quote again from the late 60s, early 70s by this American scientist who was also deemed as one of the fathers of AI, where he said like, if it works, basically people stop calling it AI. So back then, I think computer science was so innovative that a lot of people were conflating intelligent computation with conventional computation. To give a brief difference between what intelligent computation is versus what conventional computation is, typically a computer program is based on an input-output sequence where you input certain criteria to yield a particular kind of output. Now, as Smriti had mentioned, even with the existing AI, I think one of the like just to sort of slightly jump the gun, I saw one of the questions that one of the attendees had asked was, are we very close to having AI judges, or like displacing AI, like human lawyers with AI lawyers and things like that? So we are not. Like, as Smriti pointed out, we are in a space where most of the artificial intelligence tools that we have at our disposal currently are narrow or weak AI. They are different from what you would call artificial general intelligence, and certainly far away from artificial super intelligence, which are more longer term perspectives that some of the Western authors like Nick Bostrom and a few other scholars have delved into while talking about existential threats that are posed by such transformational technology. So when you are coming back to narrow AI, we are again looking at machine learning, deep learning as some of the key models that we apply for AI. So you again do require large inputs of data sets, which is where data becomes the fuel that drives AI innovation currently. But at the same time, it is not so. In conventional computation, the algorithm will not automatically learn through usage. The programmer will learn and through an iterative process try to refine it, whereas machine learning and deep learning are that difference where you call it intelligible algorithms. You are looking at algorithms that refine their accuracy rates through usage, and that again makes adoption of such technology crucial if you are looking at actually making meaningful impact through accurate AI. So those are a few initial thoughts. Now, with respect to India and the criminal justice system, India actually has been in the midst of this whole AI policy and AI ethics space only recently. Like before 2017, there were very few people who were talking about it. Most of our tech and law questions were focused on data protection, Aadhaar, and most of the offsets of Aadhaar. But now, since Niti Aayog published its paper in 2019, which is deemed internationally and domestically as India's national strategy on utilizing AI, it talks about AI is usage in 5 sectors. The judiciary or the justice system is not one of these 5 sectors, coincidentally. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court of India has undertaken some efforts to sort of talk about how AI can be used within the Indian courts and the Indian judiciary. Most recently, like one of the pilots that they sort of released last year was this neural machine translation tool called Suvas, which was launched on the National Constitution Day, November 26th last year. And that tool is a fairly simple algorithm that utilized existing pool of data, like existing pool of judgments and orders and legislation that was available in different languages to curate a data corpus. And through that same corpus, the algorithm was trained for translations in 10 different local languages. The idea is that your judgments and hopefully eventually even more legal documentation can be easily translated without resorting to paid translation tools or general translation tools which may not give legally accurate translations. So those are like 2 things. But in the criminal justice system, the most dominant use of AI is what Smriti also touched upon, facial recognition, which right now is unfortunately happening more through like a frenzied stage rather than actually being debated or deliberated and being regulated. So that leaves a lot of arbitrariness and discretion on state governments and particularly state police forces to extend its usage. So like which often results in like the use being designed or the original tool being designed for say X usage, but the usage being crept into like some other thing. For instance, Delhi government deployed this, or Delhi police rather deployed this AFRT tool, which is automated facial recognition technology, to locate missing children, which gave a very good result. And then earlier this year, we read about reports where the Delhi police was also talking about using similar technology to investigate and identify protesters in the CAA protest. Now, very different. And as Smriti pointed out, you cannot paint them with the same brush. There are not just privacy and surveillance issues involved, but also constitutional and due process issues involved in it, which I will delve a little deeper into when we get into that space. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jauhar. In fact, anyone who is interested in reading more about it, I would definitely recommend going through MIT Tech Review blogs as well as visiting the Berkman Klein website. So they have very good readings on it. You may also want to see what Telangana, Delhi government have been doing in this regard. We have a lot of tenders coming in as well. So this was very informative, Mr. Jauhar. Thank you for it. And with this, I think the question of ethics in artificial intelligence.
Just wanted to add, like on facial recognition, actually, Ms. Parsheera has written a very good paper, which I would strongly recommend that all of you should read it.
Thank you. And obviously, when we talk about facial recognition in artificial intelligence, questions about ethics in artificial intelligence also arise. And with this, I would request Prasanth to please talk about artificial intelligence and ethics.
Thanks, Abur and others. Thanks for hosting this. I mean, we had like two great opening remarks by Ameen and Smriti. So Smriti has already touched upon various aspects related to ethics of AI. Now, AI is no longer an esoteric concept. It was jargon in the earlier days when we started hearing about it. Yes, as Smriti said, this has been going on from like a long time. So although the discussions about AI started recently. Even earlier, most of the computational technologies we look at it, there definitely was an AI element. Now, let's look at the kind of applications that are there as the AI is concerned. Yes, Vidhi touched upon the area of HR, where we look at screening applications. Then there is, even if you look at content moderation by platforms like Facebook and others, AI is used in a big way. So much so that even the government, when they're talking about regulating intermediaries, are talking about having automated filters in place. Now, for having automated filters, definitely you need to rely on AI. So that's the stage that we are in. From a conceptual stage, we are looking at almost all businesses relying on artificial intelligence one way or the other. Right from the HR stage to talking to customers, let it be chatbots or maybe even consumer, let's say where you have customer contact mechanisms. All these rely extensively on AI. Now, this is where the problems could also arise. And that is where we need to look at the question of ethics. Let's look at two examples to start with, to find out what could be the problems that we face as we have, let's say, extensive adoption of AI. Again, with the current COVID scenario, we find a lot of emphasis on automated systems. When we try to reduce the human contact, we naturally tend to rely more on machines. And definitely we'll have the problems which come along with that. Let's look at, the two examples that I want to rely on is one, the case of Facebook, and one case of Google. The first instance with Facebook was, Facebook provides facilities to target advertisements. So anybody who wants to advertise on Facebook's platform, they can decide on who to target. Now, this news organization, ProPublica, found that you could even target a select group like persons who hate Jews. So your messaging could be targeted to such persons. Now, Facebook gave an explanation that this was a mistake as far as the AI is concerned, because this platform was being run by an AI engine, an artificial intelligence engine, and these categories were automatically created. So these are definitely issues that we are going to face as we rely more and more on AI and algorithms. The second is the instance of Google, where Google Home Minis were surveilling on their own owners. These devices as such were recording conversations and sending them across to Google without the knowledge of their owners. So that definitely was problematic. This was pointed out by security researchers, and yes, Google came out with a patch for that. But these are a few instances where we can find that there definitely are issues which we need to have some kind of a framework, some kind of a regulations in place. Yes, this could be self-regulation by these companies, or maybe even regulations by the government. There have been frameworks which have been proposed by civil society organizations, by companies themselves. and also by governments like the OECD framework that I will talk about. So the question here is, how can we regulate AI? What are the various ways in which we can ensure that there are ethics in place? And ethics also could be a kind of misleading term to use. That could somehow show that the onus is on the companies. Like, I mean, it's for the companies to decide whether to be ethical or not. And that may not be a right narrative as such. So that definitely is a debatable topic. I don't want to get into it at this point of time. But as of now, OECD has come up with a few principles which have also been adopted by the G20. So these principles of AI gives some kind of a basis to start this discussion on ethics. They come up with 5 major principles. One is on inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. That is, any AI technology that you use, it should be used in such a way that it encompasses all people and should result in a sustainable development. The second one is that this should be firmly be based on human rights. There's internationally accepted human rights principles and the principles of fairness. The third one is that there should be transparency, and that is where all these questions about algorithmic transparency comes into the picture. So what happens inside? So as Smriti was referring to, it all also depends on the kind of data which is fed in. Computational terms, you often say that you feed in garbage to the computer and you get garbage out. So the garbage in and the garbage out. So all depends on the data. And so there is an understanding of the kind of data that is fed in and algorithms which work behind. So there should be a greater transparency, and which should be done by the corporations who are involved in this technology. Then any technology that we adopt, the AI technologies, should be robust, secure, and then it should ensure that there is, as far as the users are concerned, these should be as let's say safe technologies. The last one is the question of accountability, especially when we have technologies like, let's say, self-driving cars being adopted in a big way. We should ensure that there should be accountable practices, and these corporations could be held accountable if anything goes wrong. So, I mean, we can get into details at a later stage, but yes, so these are the initial thoughts that I have on the topic of AI. Thank you. And ethics.
Thank you, Prasanth. In fact, I also think that, accountability by corporates is one of the key areas we lawmakers as well as policy makers need to be looking at while talking about artificial intelligence, and it should find mention in all the legislations as well. So now I request Mr. Abhayraj Naik to talk about artificial intelligence in the education sector. Handing it over to you, Mr. Naik.
Thanks, Ms. Apurva. Thanks to the organizers for putting together this event. Lovely to see some old friends here on this panel as well. I do think it's a topic that certainly deserves very many more such dialogues and discussions. And in a sense, it really is a topic where the complexity forces one to bring in not just interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity between, let's say, the natural sciences and the social sciences, including the law and policy fields, but I think it also urges us to take stock of the history of science and technology in terms of, as Smriti alluded, AI is a historically situated development, and it was preceded by many other developments when it came to science and technology and how they relate to society. And I think events such as this that turn the spotlight on regulating AI or governing AI or rights violations in the context of AI really bring that full canvas of what is the relationship between technology and society into focus again. So I think I want to, in a sense, not necessarily repeat what erudite colleagues have already said before me. How I'd like to get at this is perhaps by presenting to members of our audience today a few visual stories, right? So One, just yesterday on my Twitter feed, I came across this article of a family, a poor family in a rural part of India, an agrarian family who sold their one and only cow to buy a smartphone so that their child could attend online learning classes, right? And that cow, of course, provided milk. It was the pride of that family. It was a measure of that family's well-being. And that cow has now been replaced by a smartphone, which was essential for the young child in question to continue her education. And for me, a story such as that, though it doesn't directly involve either an algorithm or big data, or AI, as we sort of informally might refer to the complex of an algorithm, big data, the hardware, the software, and the user, it really brings out how particular choices relating to technology go all the way down to questions of class, inequality, and entitlement that one must, I think, in any discussion on AI that is happening in India, acknowledge as hugely missing from the general discussion on ethics and AI, right? Most of the discussion on ethics and AI comes out of the West. It comes out of Harvard, the Berkman Center, Oxford, the Future of Life Institute or Future of Humanity Institute. It comes out of sort of celebrity philosophers such as Nick Bostrom. But what's happening in the context of technology and education in Ghana, or what's happening in a rural school in India that suddenly is forced to translate its already problem-ridden education model to a ICT-enabled framework with some kind of systemic pressure to apply analytics, to apply machine learning, to apply big data frameworks. That context, which is a very embodied context, it, in a sense, a lot depends on whose life we are talking about, right? What does the face of that farmer look like as he's selling his cow to buy a smartphone for his child's education? So that's one story that I think is useful to, in the context of AI and education, be mindful of what's really at stake here in a country such as India. And let me sort of place my cards on the table very, very early. Unfortunately, an organization such as the Niti Aayog has been captured by a Eurocentric and pro-capital vision of AI as promoting our GDP by so many figures, right? And even the national strategy document is a result of big consultancy. It's not like the Niti Aayog produced it. It is like your Accentures and others have created it, and the Niti Aayog has stamped it with approval. And so for me, especially in the context of COVID, talking about AI and education in India must go back to the very, very real situations of poverty, inequality, patriarchy, and caste stratification, along with religious tension and the absolute vulnerability of Adivasi communities in India, right? And that sort of brings two worlds, the cool, sexy world of AI and robos that will do everything for you, with the other India that we don't talk about often enough. The second story is the story of an educator in an Indian state who used the ICT framework that his school had put in place, ostensibly. I mean, the reason for the framework, and again, this is not fully on AI, but is part of that continuum of communication and technology. He used that framework to get the phone number of a young girl student, and then began harassing her on WhatsApp through the phone number that was part of that new ICT system that the school had put in place, right? And there you have a teacher, an educator, a fiduciary in that sense, who used the sort of lack of safety that was built into the technological apparatus to then carry out real world harassment, if you wish, or non-school related context being used for harassing that student. And so in this context, I want to bring out just the safety dimension of it, and the fact that while we might have a few elite oases of education in India that indeed have teachers who are trustworthy, in the context of unequal relations between teachers and students, schools and students, universities and students, especially students who come from vulnerable communities, what does an AI generated approach to education do to these dynamics of safety or well-being or risk and harm, right? Third and final story is the story that I have encountered over the last 2 months teaching my courses at Azim Premji University, where looking at a screen where quite often even videos are turned off, so I can't see the faces of my students, at some level is so different from me being in the classroom, right? The temptation to just record myself and present that as a classroom is first and foremost there. Because almost before I get into that setting, I'm like, hey, I can barely see the students. I can't hear them because they're all on mute. There's no possibility for cracking a joke in the setting because God only knows how the setting, how the joke will translate across the internet. I can't use my hands or my body in the classroom. Zoom has breakout rooms, but Zoom doesn't really allow me to go walking around and see what the different students are doing in the class. And so I felt a inordinate sadness about how operating in this technological realm reduced the vitality, the creativity, and the possibility of being in a physical classroom, right? And as we think of machine learning and personalized learning and AI-generated learning at scale in India, this becomes a factor as well. What does it do to the actual nature of the pedagogy and the type of learning that occurs in that space? These 3 points said, let me end my opening comments by placing another one of my sort of political positions very clearly out, which is, at least in some conversations, the tendency is to bash AI. That is, AI is running amok. We need to control it. We need codes of ethics, or we need what is called the FAT approach from within the technology arena, where fairness, accountability, and transparency are part of the design of the technology, or we need a human rights approach to technology, right? These are all well taken and very, very important. And a lot of my work in this area is within this camp. That said, especially in the context of education, more so than in the context of retail or business or even the judiciary and criminal justice, I think one must acknowledge that technology and artificial intelligence have the potential to really do magic when it comes to the millions of children and millions of young people who do not have access to education, right? And therefore, I think one has to be quite balanced while talking about AI in the context of education in India. So let me stop there, and hopefully we can get into some of the details in discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Naik. In fact, I think this was a very important topic to discuss and for participants to learn about, and not to mention that we need to explore the interface of artificial intelligence from a sociological perspective as well. And with this, I will proceed to our second round of discussion. Here we have a few questions curated for the panelists. So starting with Ms. Parsheera, ma'am, as you know that we have a lot of virtual assistants like Siri and Cortana, which are females. And then there are physical robots like Hermes or Atlas, which are male. So why do you think there is a gender stereotyping in digital space, and how do we change it?
Right. So, I mean, if we dig into this, and I've looked at some of this for a paper that I was working on, there are like two possible explanations that people give. So, one explanation they give is that it's the tone and the pitch of a woman's voice, which is like suited for this, and they've done experiments, and somehow, this is what sells, and ultimately, that's the product that they're selling. But a deeper explanation could possibly also be, and one that I subscribe to, is that, it's the nature of the function that's being performed and the stereotype that is attached to that function. So if it's someone who's obeying, following your instructions, and somehow in a subservient role, it somehow sells more if that's a woman's voice which is performing those functions. And this has been controversial in all of these products that you talk about. But it's also been the case that when there's pushback against this for something like Siri, when they launched, like the default voice was that of a female. And when this became a thing, and Apple consumers are all very premium products and in that sense woke, who are raising these issues. And that pushed the company to reconsider this. And after a while, they changed that the customer could choose the default option, and there was more flexibility. And in different markets, they launched with different things. So there is that value for these issues coming out in the open domain and people questioning them. But equally, we see, like you mentioned, something like Atlas, which is basically a humanoid robot which does, like, search and rescue missions. So given that function, which is very heroic, which is supposed to be, rescuing people, the idea is that, then that fits the stereotype that, this is actually like this well-built muscular robot who is coming to our rescue and, saving us in that context. And there is research around this which has looked at many robots and tried to classify how, actually based on their underlying function, if it's somebody doing a marketing function or a PR and just supposed to talk, like something like Sophia, which is like the first robot which has got citizenship in Saudi Arabia, right? You look at her, she's modeled along Audrey Hepburn, and she's supposed to look like her, and her job is to, like, act really coy and intelligent and do marketing for the country. And that's one function, and it was believed that a pretty looking woman robot would be the one which would serve that purpose better than this muscular robot which would be used in another context. So I mean, yeah, that is a well entrenched problem in this ecosystem. And it's beyond the problem of just the fact that the developers thought this was the case. It's also the problem of us as consumers. It's a problem of the ecosystem, that at the end of the day, if someone is investing money in this, they believe that this is the product that the consumer is looking for. Presumably they've done some tests around this, and if that is what the consumer wants, then that is what is being produced. So it's kind of circular in that sense.
Definitely. And in fact, there's a whole debate on how the digital space actually promotes gender stereotypes, and we have been debating it for a long time. I hope to find a solution to it soon enough. And now I request Mr. Jauhar to address one of our questions. So Mr. Jauhar, you spoke about the willingness of CJI to adopt artificial intelligence-based systems in Supreme Court in a limited and a controlled manner. So this is a question which has featured the most in the questions we have received from our audience. So what do you think if artificial intelligence will ever be able to replace judges or lawyers in the future? So what are your thoughts on it?
See, I will again go back to what I mentioned, that in the long-term aspect, and when I say long-term, we're not talking about 5 to 10 or a few decades, we're talking about centuries and millennia. That is the definition of long-term impacts when you're studying it. So in that context, yes, there are adequate number of long-term scholars who believe that you will have artificial general intelligence and potentially a sentient artificial superintelligence being, which can arguably perform all those functions and completely displace what you have today with human capacities. But if we are looking at the immediate case, I think within the judiciary, our concerns are more near-term and more focused on what is there or what is being deliberated as being ready to be deployed, which is not that, like, so when I say, I would again like recommend that if anybody has the patience, just go read the speech that the CGI made while launching this thing. There's a clear mandate that he set, which is there in the underlying mission, that the idea is to supplement judges and not supplant them. And when I say judges, that is not just judges, it is inclusive of lawyers as well as litigants and everything. So we are essentially looking at an automation process to improve efficiency and efficacy of the justice system. We are not looking at completely dismantling the status quo and recreating something which is wholly technological or sophisticatedly automated. And to that, like the other example that I had, so India currently is not deploying any such technology, but in the West, particularly in the US and the United Kingdom, there have been instances where predictive justice tools have been deployed. So I'm assuming to some that might have the trappings of the judicial function. So most infamously, in the United States, there was this tool called Compass, which was deployed by a parole board to identify the potential risk of recidivism of inmates and accordingly give them a score based on which their ultimate parole application was decided. Now, this was, again, as I think everyone here has talked about, utilized historically biased data. It was collected, and the parameters that were deployed in it were basically using a lot of racially biased data sets, which essentially caused the algorithm to detect a higher risk of recidivism for African American males, particularly compared to their white or Hispanic or non-white other ethnical counterparts. So that is a space which is, again, like a very strong testament to the idea that right now, when we talk about the use of AI in the judiciary, we are not looking at a replacement of things. Even with respect to, say, facial recognition technology, I'm hoping that India ventures into that side in the coming months and year or so, because there is ongoing debate on it. But a lot of other jurisdictions where this technology has been more rampantly deployed, say the United States or within the EU, the conversation has been on regulating its use cases. In some cases, in an extremity, like the EU's draft white paper on AI proposed a moratorium for 5 years on any such technology being deployed. This was later rescinded in the final version. But California passed a legislation which said, to a certain extent, within their own state entities, so it's not all inclusive, but within their state departments, facial recognition technology has been suspended for the next 5 years. And similar legislations have also been introduced in the US Senate, particularly by one African American congressman, Cory Booker, who was also one of the contenders for the Democratic ticket for this year's presidential election. He piloted this bill, which was talking about imposing a moratorium, setting up a committee within the Congress to formulate rules and regulations. So to just sum it up, we are at a very, like, again, despite the fact that we have been talking about AI for decades, those conversations have largely been about technological innovation. Governance and regulation of AI is a fairly recent theme. It has primarily surfaced over the last 5 to 10 years. And again, as I think Abhayraj pointed out, that it's basically a predominance of Western hemisphere and like Western scholars who are debating this. We need a more diverse perspective, even on the ethical standpoints, and like when you're talking about AI ethics, when you're talking about AI governance, and even like long-term and short-term risks, because these will definitely vary from system to system, country to country, and you cannot advocate a one-stop solution or a one-size-fit-all solution template. That is a recipe for disaster. Unfortunately, in our country, that is the history of most policy making. We do tend to do that, especially in areas where we don't understand what we are grappling with. AI certainly seems to be that. So the risk of, again, reducing ourselves to a one-stop shop or a one template for all kind of AI related issues. Somebody even asked that, I think, in the questions. That is not going to be feasible, and we should not limit ourselves to it, is my short answer.
Thank you, sir. In fact, it's not the debate of AI versus humans. It's basically how they can complement each other and how AI can help humans in doing a lot of functions which we do. And Prashant, now to you. we have received a lot of questions on the data ethics being sidelined during the development of artificial intelligence softwares. So how do you think it can be ensured that artificial intelligence softwares abide by the principles of data ethics?
Yeah, definitely it's a complex issue by itself. I mean, how do you really regulate this and ensure that the companies, the corporations abide by these principles? So, I mean, it's the similar kind of a debate that happens, whether it's in the area of privacy or in other areas also. The questions whether what is the best model to go for, whether we need self-regulation by the bigger corporations, whether we need to go for something like a co-regulation, or do we need government regulation? There's no easy answer to it. But we are often seeing that self-regulation doesn't often work. When you expect the companies by themselves to ensure that any, let's say, the product that they come up with, or the users that they put technologies to, that it stays within the principles, within the human rights principles, often it doesn't work. That is where you need governments to step in. That is where you need some kind of a framework, whether maybe it's where you have governments across the world coming together to have some kind of a global standards in place, or maybe the various governments with countries, like for example, India can decide what's the kind of law that we should have in place. There was a question asked, like whether we need an AI code as far as India is concerned. Now, one starting place could be the data protection and the privacy law. In fact, we even don't have a data protection law in the first place. That is something that we need to start with. So if you look at the European Union, GDPR looks into these aspects of how, the kind of, let's say, when we look at it from a privacy angle, a data protection angle, what can AI do and how to regulate AI? So these are questions that we need to definitely ask. And these are bigger policy debates happening across the world. There are various countries which are looking at coming up with laws to regulate AI, looking at the questions of liability. Yes, we have a discussion started by, let's say, Niti Aayog, but as it was pointed out by Abhay, see, this cannot be restricted to a few consultancies or a few corporations deciding it. We need larger debates. We need civil society to come in. We need government to come up with the broader debates and broader consultations. So yes, definitely AI needs to be regulated. We need to look at the ethics angle and how data will be used by these organizations, so that there are principles of human rights and human rights law are adhered to by the corporations. Thank you.
Thank you, Prasanth. In fact, I would request our participants to definitely go through the framework which is in pipeline by the UNESCO. So it is a framework on artificial intelligence, which is at the consultative stage currently, and they are also accepting recommendations by individuals. So I would request you all to go through it once. And now I would like to request Mr. Naik to answer one of the questions. So as you have seen, sir, in the past, we have seen schools adopting interactive boards, etc., to improve learning outcomes. So how do you think AI can play a role in equality in education system and inclusion? And how do we address the questions of privacy and security which may arise?
Thanks, Mr. Purva. So I think, two super sources that I would certainly straight off want to introduce into the conversation that have gotten into this larger area of AI and education in a somewhat detailed way. One, like you mentioned, UNESCO is, of course, now carrying out a global global consultation on AI and ethics generally. But in 2019, UNESCO released a lovely working paper. I'm sorry, there's an aeroplane flying around here, so let me just wait for him to fly over. Yeah, in 2019, UNESCO released a lovely working paper on AI in education specifically, and I'll certainly recommend that for anyone who's interested in that field. And that paper gives you some good examples, and I think it's always useful, especially in discussions on AI where everybody seems to know everything, but finally nobody seems to know anything really specifically. You know, it's a great fuzzy area where there are a lot of rhetorical points made. Let's look at China, right? So in China, there's a platform called Liu Lishuo, which manages to teach 6 lakh students English at the cost of what one teacher would be paid in China, right? And for a country such as China, where a lot of kids, including kids from rural backgrounds, want to learn English, but access to English classes are sometimes prohibitive, this kind of platform is definitely directly helping in terms of inclusion, right? If you look at the example of what is regarded in the world of AI and education as one of the most promising programs, something called the Plan Cibal, which was launched in Uruguay. This has, and it's a maths-based adaptive learning platform, AI-powered. This has almost 3,000 exercises that are solved step by step, and you can sort of solve those exercises with the system, and the system will learn exactly where you're going wrong in your mathematical thinking and give you the answer that has been evading you for a long time. Now, as someone who had a very scary Kashmiri maths teacher and was too scared to learn, to ask her any questions, and therefore never learned maths too well in school, if I had the Plan Cibal, I would have gotten instantaneous feedback. I would have got it exactly catered to me, and I would have got it at any time that I wanted. I mean, my Kashmiri maths teacher was more focused on all these kids who were going to crack the IIT and become the pride of the school. So she was not so interested in me, and I wasn't complaining. I was happy to be left in the corner. But I mean, at the end of the day, I didn't learn math as well as I could. And that kind of AI platform would have helped me even if my teacher was a bit scary for me, right? So again, you see how inclusion comes in here, where the machine really doesn't discriminate against anyone in terms of whoever wants to access it can access it if they are given the access credentials. Now, the second part of the question is very, very important though. Unfortunately in India, and I'll end with this, we only see the advantages and we totally ignore the disadvantages. On the disadvantages, because this is going to lead to what Accenture calculates, AI in India is going to lead to 1.9% of GDP increase, the disadvantages are all reduced. And if you read the Niti Aayog AI strategy note carefully, there's also a sort of very conscious move to place responsibility away from the companies, right? Let's not make it strict liability. Let's not bring in criminal law. Let's keep it all civil law. There is the harm no one wants to own, and everyone wants to own and benefit from the money. But I think unless these systems are designed, ethics by design approach is followed, and the CBSE has an AI integration module already in place. It's there, how to integrate AI into the CBSE education across the country. In that technology design process, it must be a very, very focused process that looks at all possible harms that might arise, including bias, including gender-based stereotyping, including, of course, invasion of privacy. And unless the technological design is robust, one must not be able to make money out of it. So I think, I hope I'm responding to your question. There's great potential for inclusion. There's great potential for equity. I'm a career academic. I never have enough time to give the students the attention that they deserve. However, even if I don't sleep at all, there is still at least one student who's like, I wish he had spent some more time answering my question or talking to me some more or giving me more substantive comments, right? The machine doesn't have those constraints. The machine doesn't need to sleep or to eat or to stop teaching and go and do something that's relaxing and not connected with work. So inclusion has huge potential, but unless the design is robust and has ethics built in from the get-go, you should not at scale promote AI-based education.
Thank you, sir. In fact, I think a lot of us here could use softwares like Plancy World. All of us struggled with certain subjects in school as well as law school. So I also, at the same time, I would request all the panelists to keep looking at the Q&A section and answering the questions there as well. And now I'd ask a question to Ms. Parsheera. Ma'am, when we talk about privacy, we often include discussions on facial recognition shaping the surveillance capitalism ecosystem with respect to the targeted advertisements. So how do you think the right to privacy in India works vis-a-vis the facial recognition?
So, facial recognition, there are two kinds of use cases, right? One is by the state, which someone had asked in the question, also questions, right? The NCRB's use, and one is the use by private entities. And there, when you talk about something like targeted advertising, there are grades in which this can happen, right? So there is one kind of facial recognition, which is actually how it's defined, where the system is used to either verify my identity or to do a one-on-one matching that I am who I claim to be based on an existing photograph that the system has. But a lot of advertisement application, and I don't think this is happening yet in India, but globally, the application we're seeing is that, you go before a display screen, and based on my profile, so it doesn't need to know my specific identity, but it's based on my profile that, okay, I look like a woman who is in her 30s, who is like, of this ethnicity, and therefore will display clothes which may be to my liking. So that's one kind of use case which is out there. The other kind of use case is that you go into a store and there will be a algorithm which will track you through the store. Again, it may not be specific to my identity, but it's specific to that this person went from this counter to that counter and that counter and touched this product, and therefore those are her interest areas. So I think once we come to questions of regulation, so firstly, the PDP bill which is in the pipeline talks about face and all of other biometrics as sensitive data. So there is an additional level of security attached to it, and there are additional burdens that one has to comply with when you're using that kind of sensitive data. And one of them is that you have to minimize the data that you use, and the data that you use has to be exactly mapped to the purpose you're trying to achieve. So going back to the question on targeted advertising, if your objective is to generally profile me and not know me as an individual, then if you try to take data which is specific to my face and identifies me, that is exceeding that mandate, because you're not taking my data for a purpose that you need. So you're exceeding the purpose of that data. So I mean, those are kind of things that are happening, but I think more of the conversation on facial recognition, more of the pushback is so far on the state side of it, although so much is happening on the private side. I'm not sure if targeted advertisement is the biggest use case right now, but things like unlocking of mobile phones, so use of biometrics for that purpose has become pretty much an everyday use right now, and like a lot of us also might be using it, certainly with fingerprints, if not with our faces, right? So those kind of use cases have really slipped through, while everybody is talking about the state's use and questioning that, which is of course a very important question. But all of these uses are already in vogue, and it's already happening minus a robust framework to govern it.
Thank you, Ms. Parsheera. In fact, one of the books on this, which I found to be very useful, was the book called Surveillance Capitalism by Zuboff. So anyone who is very interested in reading about how the companies target you, I would definitely recommend it. It's a very long book, but a very interesting read. And now I'd request Mr. Jauhar to answer one of the questions. Thank you, Ms. Parsheera. Mr. Jauhar, do you think there is a way where AI can play a more effective role in criminal justice system without actually resorting to surveillance?
Yes, short answer, definitely. I feel that even technologies which prima facie can have surveillance capacities, like when we talk about criminal justice, you're not just talking about criminal trials, you're talking about investigation, which is all about surveillance and monitoring. So as long as you're accomplishing that in some regulated and non-arbitrary manner, I feel that it certainly has the leeway to improve the efficiency and efficacy. Like one of the best advantages of something like a facial recognition technology, just to play the devil's advocate, would be that you can do mass surveillance at a safe distance where you are not endangering your physical self. Like it's not a police officer or an undercover officer actually accosting someone physically, which may jeopardize her security.
and physical well-being, but you're doing it from a safe distance, and you can do it for hundreds of thousands of people much more expeditiously. That is the biggest selling point when any law enforcement official talks about it, not just in India, but even internationally, that it is efficient. But where is that cost of efficiency? And that is exactly, so I would again reiterate that particularly in the criminal justice system, your cost is not just state surveillance and privacy concerns. There is a larger constitutional question at play. We all know that procedural due process is an integral part within Indian courts. Like when you are being hauled up before a court in any kind of case, civil or criminal, procedural due process and substantive due processes have to be abided to. Take an example where, as Smriti has pointed out, and a lot of research has pointed out, the high risk of inaccuracies when you're talking about facial recognition too. Now, someone, and this is not just a hypothetical, in the United States, most recently during the Black Lives Matter protest a few weeks back, they actually recorded their first instance of a wrongful incarceration of an individual due to being wrongfully identified by a facial recognition tool. A similar case was also detected after the Sri Lankan terror attacks a few years back, when a student studying in Brown University in the United States was wrongfully identified as someone who had committed those terror attacks when she was not even there. So here, it's not just about surveillance. I'm not just considering like repression and the outcomes or the challenges that it poses to my right to congregate and express myself. There are constitutional challenges. I could actually end up losing my life or liberty. And we all know once you're in that system, criminal justice is far from perfect in India. It takes years even for you to secure your bail if you're not a person of means and resources. And examine that in the background of, again, like the place where we have systemically discriminated against Adivasis or religious minorities, and how you can actually weaponize this to dismantle the overall due process protection that our law affords and our constitution guarantees. Those are considerations which need to be taken realistically when you are talking about any kind of criminal justice application of AI or basically of facial recognition or predictive justice. Because you're not just talking about, like, at the cost of like my umpteenth repetition, because this is a pet peeve for me, it's not just about surveillance. It goes beyond that. I can very easily lose my life and liberty, or at least my liberty, and get incarcerated, which is violative of Article 21 more than just the right to privacy. And we denied due process for a long time because unless there are clear guidelines on where courts can rely on such evidence, which your current IT Act does not provide for, your Evidence Act is outdated, so you do not have a legislation. This will inevitably come, like most other technological evidence, this will come to like the courts to determine, and there it's anybody's game, depending on who's adjudicating your case. So there are inherent risks when you promote the idea of using it in the criminal justice system, particularly, that venture beyond your other domain uses.
Thank you, sir. Moving to Prasanth. Prasanth, in light of protests against racism in the United States, companies like IBM and Amazon have limited their facial recognition technologies. On the other hand, we also have companies like Clearview as well as Rank One, which still operate in this market. So what do you think is the extent of corporate responsibility in the development and operation of facial recognition technology, including the inaccuracy and harm caused as a result?
Yeah, Purva. Definitely facial recognition technology can be problematic. We have seen this debate happening in the US. Now, if you look at the Indian scenario, we have seen a lot of law enforcement agencies and governments using facial recognition in a big way. Even in the recent COVID lockdowns instances, we have seen drones being used in a big way and photographs being taken of people who are, let's say, violating the lockdown rules, etc. So, see, this can have like big repercussions for an individual, for a citizen and her rights. If you are recognized wrongly by the software, that could mean, again, us Amin mentioned, imprisonment, it's a long drawn out process, all that. So where do you draw the line here? Where do you decide that, yes, you could have facial recognition for these users, where you could have facial recognition for maybe some other, let's say verticals is possible, some may not be possible. So if you look at the US, we have seen a law being passed by Washington, the state of Washington, saying that you cannot have facial recognition for this. And they have limited the use only to a few areas, like where you try to find out missing persons and things like that. So definitely we need to have more detailed discussions on this. We had, like, as you pointed out, we had bigger corporations like Amazon, IBM and all deciding that they will not sell facial recognition technologies to police forces. But again, there are other companies who are still doing that. So where do you really draw this line is a problem. And that is where we need to ensure that we have laws in place so that these technologies are not misused. And that is definitely important in the India context, where we don't even have, like I mentioned earlier, we don't even have a data protection law in the first place. So these discussions need to look at, I mean, these are evolving technologies and technologies evolving at a very rapid and fast pace. So the lawmakers, the legislature also has to, like, say, ramp up the act, make sure that we have proper mechanisms in place, proper laws in place, so that the rights of individuals are not affected.
Thank you, Prasanth. In fact, we do have a PDP bill in the pipeline, but even in its current form, it's very problematic because it gives the government and the DPA a lot of power to exempt government agencies from the ambit of the bill. And with this, I'd move to Mr. Naik. So as a teacher yourself, you'd be very well aware how students have different learning levels which require that different and have different capabilities of learnings. So what do you think is the role of artificial intelligence and what are its potential benefits or risks in assessing the characteristics and skills of a student?
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. So let me use this opportunity to also respond to some of the questions directed at me in the chat box. And I think as many of my co-panelists have been suggesting, the answer is textured, and it is a complex answer depending on who you're talking about and what specific frame of the AI process you're talking about, right? So at a very high level, 100% yes, AI has great potential to deliver personalized, adaptive, tailored, at scale learning to students, right? And as I sort of mentioned in my last comment, the machine can do this better than a teacher can, simply because the teacher does not have access to does not have both access and does not have ability to process, if he or she has access, all of the data flows that a machine can process. And I mean, just to sort of provide the complexity of talking about AI. So another company called Hujiang in China, they use facial recognition in an educational context, where the machine actually, through facial recognition and computer vision, is able to tell the teacher when a particular student's facial expressions are indicating that she is not understanding what is being said in class, right? So facial recognition, otherwise, especially in the criminal context and in terms of surveillance and privacy debates, is always scary and problematic. But I, as a teacher, would love the fact in the last row whose face I can't see at all, I get one input that, yeah, she's not getting what I'm saying. I'm speaking too philosophically or too fast or whatever, right? That said, let's look at the other bit of the complexity here. I can provide personalized, adaptive, tailored learning for as many students as there are there through an AI platform, and by simply using machine learning well. At the same time, and this is the second source that I wanted to mention that I didn't get to. So Gurumurthy Kasinathan from IT for Change has a lovely paper on AI in education in India. It's the only good paper that I've seen that focuses on India, commissioned by Frederick Ebert Stiftung as part of a series on AI. And from there, there is this little reference to some other scholars and how they point out a risk with AI leading to what is called learnification. What is learnification? Where data-driven, personalized education focuses on learning rather than education and on processes rather than teachers and students. So what is a social activity of learning is broken into quantifiable cognitive and pedagogic units: instruction, quizzes, assignments, tests, etc. And rather than the long-term outcome of an education, and for me, an education should be the 21st century skills, right? Of my student having a sense of discrimination, of critical thinking, open-ended exploration, of having courage, honesty, curiosity. Those kinds of things will disappear, right? The final comment, and this came up through a question, and you know, a lot depends on the users of the AI platform. So not just the consumers, but in the case of education, what will happen when teachers and AI platforms hit each other, right? And part of my work with IIITB in Bangalore on a project that focuses on humanizing automation, point out that AI technologies can never actually get into that tacit knowledge that people have. The tacit knowledge of a policeman relating to Ameen's comments earlier, right? Or the tacit knowledge of an interviewer who sees the gender dimensions involved in an admission process will never properly be captured by an algorithm, right? And so I think a lot of research needs to be done in terms of how can we actually prepare teachers and students to work with AI. And for me, the solution, again, is involve the teachers and the students in the design of the AI, right? And so my last pot shot at predatory capital, since you bought out Zuboff's work earlier, is unfortunately education and AI in India is fully commoditized. There are no open source frameworks. The data sets are not publicly available. And so people are more interested in making money rather than pooling their resources to prevent harm from occurring. So we need to recognize the public dimensions of the infrastructures of AI in education as well. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, we are entering the last leg of a set of questions. And I would also request all the panelists to kindly keep answering the Q&A section. There's a separate section for it in the Zoom chat box. So starting with Prasanth. Prasanth, there was one of the questions we received from the audience, and that was, how can we prevent algorithmic discrimination by AI to protect the right privacy of marginalized citizens? So what are your thoughts on it? Prasanth?
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay. See, again, I mean, when it comes to the entire decision-making process and the discussions about algorithmic transparency, the question is how all these decisions are made. What we need to have is like a trail in place. It's not, you often hear about how this could affect trade secrets of corporations and things like that. That's not the issue here. To draw a parallel, let's look at maybe an administrative decision which is made by the government or a government body when it comes to judicial review. The question that's asked by the court is, what was the procedure that was followed? It should be a similar test that we should have here. So what should be the kind of a test, let's say the procedure followed by an AI, by an algorithm to arrive at a decision. So that is where we can find out whether there was any discrimination, what was the procedure followed, whether that was discriminative in nature. And yes, that if we have such checks and balances in place, then we can definitely ensure that there is no discrimination. And a person who is affected could also have a, let's say, remedy in place. He should have a right to ask the AI, ask the let's say the company which is running a software, as how this process was initiated, how the decision was arrived at. So that organization should be able to explain the decision making process. They cannot say that this is a black box. Something goes inside and we have this output, and we cannot really explain what went inside. That should not be the way it works. That is where a person, a citizen, should have the right to ask, please explain it to me as to how you arrived at this decision. And that, I think, can ensure that a lot of, let's say, discrimination, a lot of bad practices let's say, can be countered.
Thank you, Prashant. Ms. Parsheera, to you, what role do you think law as an instrument can play to bring gender equality in the functioning of artificial intelligence?
Well, a lot, but I think we need to place this in the context of, is there even a law on discrimination in India in the first place? Because when you look at the constitution, of course, it's giving very strong protections, against the state, but we don't really have a cross-cutting law which says do not discriminate against women or any other group in particular. I mean, you have narrower laws, you have the Equal Remuneration Act, you have laws on disabilities, but you don't have a cross-cutting discrimination law. And a lot of time when people talk about AI ethics, they say that, it should be treated at the same level of fairness and non-discrimination that human beings would. So, if a private corporation, which is, just the parent of the person, introducing the AI, is not subject to certain requirements, then the question becomes about whether, because they are doing it in the form of AI, does this create additional barriers? So it's a requirement to fundamentally rethink our whole framework on discrimination, because without that, we'll keep hearing this pushback and this kind of an argument saying that, if person's doing something wrong, if, a manager at a bank decides whether or not to give a loan to someone, if that's not something, which amounts to discrimination, and that's not something that can be challenged, then why should it be, challenged when it's done algorithmically? So we need to stand back and, rethink both of these rounds, because I believe that discrimination on both of these counts needs to come up, and we can't have an isolated conversation on AI discrimination. But to some extent, now this is sought to be, addressed through the PDP bill, because one of the harms that it talks about, so it has a set of harms. If you perform one of those harms and the person is harmed and there is some loss occurring to them, they're entitled to compensation. And one of the harms listed there is discriminatory treatment. But of course, it is open how this will be interpreted, minus a clear theory of discrimination against private actors. Suddenly you have a regulator who's going to start interpreting these things. It could turn out to be quite bad in terms of what outcomes will come out of it. And they could really indiscriminately call anything discretion or nothing discrimination. So that's something which we'll have to wait and watch.
Definitely. In fact, I'm very interested in looking at how the discriminatory harm relates to algorithmic accountability as well in the future with respect to the PDP bill. Mr. Naik, since you teach climate change and justice at Azim Premji University, this was one of the questions we received regarding climate change. The question is that what is the role of artificial intelligence in relation to climate change, both at global level and domestically? So if you could please address it.
Wow, I'm so happy to receive that question. So let me respond with my limited knowledge, because I don't know the full answer. But I think the role of artificial intelligence with regard to climate change is mostly with regard to its ability to process massive amounts of data that scientists have so far found difficult to process, and through neural network-based processes of inference actually pick up patterns from that data. So if you think of something like climate change, there is atmospheric data, soil level data, temperature, precipitation. It's called a wicked problem for that reason, right? There are so many moving parts, and it's difficult for most of us to make sense of all of those parts and actually accurately model and forecast what will happen. And AI really has the ability to do that better than the best scientists in the world so far had the ability to do it, right? So now scientists plus AI means that we actually can understand better what is happening and what is going to happen, and really go back from the start of recorded time go back to information we get from ice samples that more than 10,000 years back, what the temperature and weather were like. All of those can be fed into the AI system, and the AI system gives us understanding that we couldn't otherwise access based on non-machine learning processes. The caveat to note, and this is again something that most people who think of technology don't acknowledge, is that any kind of compute intensive process requires a lot of energy. And I mean, even in the PDP bill, unfortunately, no one talks about what data centers in India are going to do to our energy injustice, right? Already farmers are struggling for electricity to put water in their fields, but some thousands of new data centers are going to take so much more energy. And where does that energy come from in India? It comes from coal. And what happens when you burn coal? You put carbon into the atmosphere. So AI also has costs in terms of the emission side of the climate crisis story. So hope that's useful.
Thank you, Mr. Naik. Mr. Jauhar, one of the questions which we received with respect to the criminal justice system was that in the absence of stringent cyber laws, how can we ensure that the safety and security of the work done in the legal field through artificial intelligence, keeping in mind the confidentiality of the information involved?
See, the point is, I don't think we can, to be honest. That's the underlying linchpin of my whole argument, that
Right.
we seem to, like, historically, whenever we've talked about any kind of technological advancement in our country, especially within the judiciary or the justice system, I will take you back like a decade and a half when narco analysis were big, and all kinds of tada pota courts were basically talking about subjecting people to narco analysis and things like that. And we all know the outcome of it. Eventually, after a series of litigation over a decade, it finally got struck down as something that was not just unconstitutional, but deeply, deeply invasive and problematic. And we as a society could not collectively like accept its usage within our criminal justice system. Again, due process being an underlying argument for that. So even with AI, I think we are always in that rush, and it's not just with facial recognition is probably the most stark example of that in India. With respect to the criminal justice system, where we've completely jumped the gun and started deploying it without any mandates. Forget like identifying the use cases for it. We have no, like, it's completely to the discretion of whoever is sitting in that police room, police station, or like whoever his superior officer is, to take calls on it and deploy them wherever they deem it fit. There are and like ultimately, in the absence of the law, all of this will go to the courts. We all know that, where our courts, inherently being a common law system, have ample powers under the constitution to reverse certain decisions. But like I said, that is a 50-50 thing. You don't know, like the reality of jurisprudence is that courts are not as neutral and impartial to everything as we are taught in law school, or like how the judges propose themselves to be. So those biases that you are seeing in the algorithm can like they stem from our societal biases, and the judges are not free of them. So should these matters actually go to court in the absence of a law, will that mean that the courts will always rule in favor of constitutional morality? Not necessary. We have plenty of jurisprudence in our constitutional law history which disproves that notion. So I think, like, to simply again answer that, in the absence of such legislation and regulation, you have unfortunately put the cart before the horse and created a sequence of events that readily and rapidly needs to be reversed in that process. You need, if you are going to talk about facial recognition particularly, because that's the most prominent example. I'm not touching on predictive justice and any other things because those are more hypothetical as of now. But if you are going to talk about facial recognition tools, you need governance frameworks for that. It cannot be done in a space of carte blanche for the states and state authorities.
Thank you, sir. With this, I think we are also approaching the end of this webinar. So on behalf of Mishi, Choudhary and Associates and RGNUL RSSR Student Law, I would like to thank each of our panelists for taking out time for this webinar and to our participants for joining us here today. We had around 170 participants in the audience, and we received a lot of audience questions which we couldn't address because of paucity of time. But however, I'm sure the guidance provided by our panelists will be very informative and helpful for our panelists, for our participants. I would also like to express gratitude to Lawctopus for hosting this webinar on their platform. And before I end this webinar, I would like to inform our participants that Mishi, Choudhary and Associates, in association with RSSR, RGNUL, are also going to roll out a blog series on artificial intelligence soon. So I hope it will be very helpful for all of you, and I really hope that you enjoyed this webinar. And again, thank you to all the panelists for being here and addressing a lot of questions by our participants.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the excellent moderation, Apurva.
Thank you, Smriti.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.